So where do you think the most dairy in the world is produced? It's not the US, it's not in Europe where we love cheese, it is from India. India's been getting in fights with the US this month about the tariffs because Modi said, I'm forbidden to export milk to US. India's consolidated their dairy industry and nationalized it in a big way, but it also has kept the farmers themselves owning 1 or 2 or 3 cows. When you think about like nationalization of dairy industries, actually the US is sort of a front runner. And if you think about like Got Milk campaigns, which are such a weird choice that was so effective when I was growing up. Walk with me on my series, Actually What's Happening, where we get away from breaking news. We talk about big global issues and patterns that are happening in the news globally. Today we're going to talk about why your food system is broken. And I think it's really, really crazy to think about like the way that our interconnected global food chain, like really we all impact each other. I talked about that last month a little bit when I talked about famine and how that is defined. And importantly, this month, famine was declared in Gaza when it had not been yet in my previous video about this. And that means that people like Cindy McCain, who oversee the World Food Program, can go into Gaza and try to get more food there. We can access more resources and funding and all that kind of stuff to try to get food into Gaza. And so for the rest of us in the world too, there is a big interconnected global food chain that is connecting all of us. We depend on things like dairy from India. But a small number of companies globally control the inputs into our agricultural market. So I've been reading this book, Titans of Industrial Agriculture by Dr. Jennifer Clapp. She's a Canadian professor. Super, super smart, super good book if you have time to read this like tome. There are 4 things that we sort of need in order to make food work at scale. One is like seeds, one is fertilizer, pesticides, and farm equipment. And we need to have those things sourced well so that we can like build food really well. And what she's done is she's tracked over the last 200 years how each of those 4 industries have consolidated into basically 4 to 6 major global conglomerates control those industries. And that is like not great for humanity for all the normal monopolization reasons about like competition and pricing and stuff. But it's also not great because it makes it so that we don't have the same kind of diversified ecosystem that as climate change and other kinds of problems come into the world geopolitically, we can't be as resilient against those. I've become kind of obsessed with these like driverless tractors that are taking over fields. Have you seen these? They're like a Waymo, but for fields. It feels very like we're living in the future. And it could be really good for humanity because actually like being out on the farm all the time in some ways is pretty hard on your body. And so the thing is that those tractors, the AI driven tractors, are mostly owned by John Deere, which owns about 40% of the US market. And when people buy into the John Deere ecosystem, they have to buy huge, like very expensive equipment. And when they do that, they can't repair their own equipment if it breaks. They have to take it to a John Deere dealership. The FTC is suing John Deere in order to get farmers more rights over the equipment that they buy. And our queen Lena Khan has been like running that show, and it's incredible to watch. However, it does seem like the Trump administration will probably like pull that back because, you know, they're so pro-business, they don't really care about these things. It says like it's hard to track monopolization across a global scale, but for sure the seed industry at least is consolidated just like this in the UK and Denmark and Thailand and I don't know where else, South Africa, Brazil, Italy, Turkey, so many places. And what that means is that when we run into these problems where like geopolitically, for example, there are tariffs that are making the milk hard to travel from India to other countries like the US, or if Ukraine is having a hard time farming its grain because it is in a war zone and the farmers can't get to it. When you run into these problems where Japan can't produce enough rice or where Brazil is not producing enough coffee, if you have bird flu cutting through the chicken population, if you don't have the resources being put in place in order to diversify that food ecosystem so that it can be more resilient both to things like climate change and also to geopolitics, it makes it so that we have a weaker system and can get into places where like different countries can end up starving when they don't have to, right? And it's a lot of people will say, and I know this is true, that we have more food than needed. Like we have enough food to feed the whole world if we could just get it to people. And that's true. But it's also true that we have to produce the right like mix of food. And we also need to make sure that we have a resilient food supply chain for everybody as well. And so while famine's happening in Sudan and in Gaza, and while other people, even in industrialized countries, can't get enough food for themselves, we have to make sure that the chain itself is also secure. And part of the problem against that is that we have these huge mega corporations that are not looking out for the interests of every human. They're looking out for their own bottom line. So that's what's happening this month in the food supply. I don't know. That's a long rant, but you know, what do you want to know about next?